Hi, I'm Elaine Holden. Thank you for joining me here on Channel 96. Education matters. Yes, it does matter, and it matters a lot. You know, over the years, I have spent a lot of time working on reading research, getting a lot of information about reading so that I can help parents and teachers, my graduate students, be better at what they do. What is it that they do? Well, it's the job of childhood to learn how to read. And adults have to help children with their first job. And we right now have about 54 million children in school in America. And these children are at their first job. They're learning to read. We also know that from research, about 50% of those children are not learning to read. They're not succeeding at their job. And that translates, if you're doing the division, to about 25 million children. And we have children right now graduating from high school who are at the 6th grade or below as readers, and yet they're graduating from high school and trying to get a job out in the workforce, out in the world of work. It's getting kind of concerning, and it's been getting kind of concerning for a few years now. The question, of course, is what can we as parents, grandparents, educators do about this? How can we help our children? Well, I've been a graduate school professor for a long, long time, and I have to say, one of the things that I always do is look at the research. The research that I look at started in 1985. Yeah, and it was the Health Research Extension Act. Congress passed this, gave a lot of money to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. They started out with 10,000 children in their database, and they studied these children. They also went to educators and they said, you know, we're seeing these kids, they don't know how to read. They can't get jobs. They're not good at what they're doing as adults. We need help. They need help. What do we do? And the educators said, well, they're learning disabled. We can't teach them to read. These kids are just not learning to read. They don't know how. They're disabled. It just doesn't work. The Health Research Extension Act researchers said, nah, we don't think so. So they started investigating. Well, what did they find? They found that in over 90% of the cases, these children were not learning disabled. The one and only difficulty they had was in learning to read. What does that say? Well, what it says to us, unfortunately, is that the methodology used to teach these children to read really wasn't very good. What were they using in those days? So they were using something called whole language. And I have to say, 50% of the kids, maybe 40, depending on the part of the country you're in, 40 to 50% of those children will learn to read and write with ease. And they will learn using whole language. No problem. You give them the book, they'll learn how to read it. They'll figure it out. But for 50 and sometimes 60% of the children, that doesn't happen. And these are the children that are graduating from high school and many times leaving school early without those reading skills. And then they start to struggle as adults. They've already struggled as children. They felt very bad about themselves many times going through the schools because they don't realize that it's not them. They're smart, they're capable. They have not been taught the way they learn. This is called the reading wars. Now, supposedly, the reading wars are done. People have said, yep, whole language doesn't work. We need phonics. And phonics is part of the answer, but it's not the entire part. There's also something called phonology. And I have to say, as a graduate school professor, this is one of the concerns I have, because when I start working with my graduate students, I try to find out whether they know the difference between phonics and phonology. And the truth of the matter is most of them don't. Sadly, they think it's the same thing. But it's not. Phonics is a representation, visual representation, of the sounds of the language. Sounds make words. We have over 1 million words in the English language, and we only have 45 sounds. We mix them, we match them, we kind of get them all stirred up there, and with those 45 sounds called phonemes, we make about 1 million words. It's pretty amazing. But there are children, about 30%, that simply cannot get that language drilled down to the individual sounds. They're pretty good with words and sentences, but they don't get the individual sounds. And you only have 26 letters, right? So what happens? How do you get those 45 sounds maxed out as far as, getting them on paper when you've only got 26 letters? Well, we have a number of letters that take more than one sound. And those are usually the vowel sounds. And I'm just going to give you one example. The letter A, first letter in our alphabet. And we have A, like apron, the beginning of a word. A, it says its own name. It's an open syllable. We also have cake. A vowel, A, a consonant, K, and then a silent E. And that silent E makes the A say its own name. So it's a consonant, silent E pattern. But wait, there's more. We also have A coming after the letter W. And it often, not always, but often says aw, like water and wasp and watch. And when A comes in front of L and any other consonant, it also says aw, like talk and walk. But there's more. The A can also say like a table, a chair, a desk. That's called the schwa, the unaccented A. And then how about the A in father? Father. So think of all of the different sounds A has. And if you have a child who is exposed to print in the first grade or even in the second grade, and that child doesn't have an understanding of what those sounds can be for just that letter A, that poor child is going to be terribly confused because there's one more sound. It's a, like in cat and hat and mat. And what happens then? Usually the child is told, well, A says a. So now they're going to look at the word water and say watter. And they're going to look at the word walk and say whack. And they're going to look at the word cake and say cack. And it's going to go downhill from there. Because there's actually a pattern to how we say those different letters for sounds. So we look at the A as an open syllable or a closed syllable or a vowel, consonant, silent E syllable. It's very systematic. And that's called structured literacy. We have a structure to our, we present the stuff. So when we look at a lesson plan for a child or a group of children, what we're doing is looking at a systematic way to instruct children. So we go from the sounds, the 45 sounds, and making sure that these children are capable of teasing out the individual sounds. How do we do that? Well, for example, I'll say bold, and they'll say bold. Now say bold without the b. And they think about it and say old. Got it. Say winter, and they'll say winter. Say winter without the t. Winter. That's how you manipulate the sounds. It's called the elision task. And those separations of sounds, the conceptualizing of sound shifts and sound deletion in words and in syllables is what helps a child develop phonology, an understanding of the sounds of the language. And once that has happened, then you can turn around and start to say, and here are the letters that represent these sounds. It's a pretty exciting thing. And that's where a child learns the sounds of the language first, the phonology. And then the next step, the second stage in the reading process is matching the sounds to the letters in a very systematic fashion. This helps them really do their job, which is, of course, as I said, learning to read, right? I'm quoting Dr. Sally Shaywitz, by the way. She's at Yale. She's one of the most brilliant researchers. She's a medical doctor and has spent so many years really investigating dyslexia and reading disorders. And so when we look at that child matching up the letters and the structures of the words to the various possibilities for sounds, they're pretty well on their way to learning how to read. Now the next step is to have them automatic, because as they start to develop those skills, it's changing the neurology of the brain. It's actually building nice little pathways. These pathways are really turning into superhighways as they get on in their process of matching those sounds and the symbols. And once that happens, then they develop something called fluency. And that's where they can read groups of words, like parts of sentences. And there's a whole thing with fluency. Fluency is one of these processes that develops over a number of years. So you have phonology, the sounds, and then you have the sound symbol association, and then you have the automaticity and the fluency. And we bring in vocabulary because, let's face it, if you can read words, but you don't know what those words mean, you're not going to get a lot from the material. So naturally, we have to talk about words and what they mean and the different possibilities. For example, say a child learns to read the word ring. Fine. But if you only have a ring on your finger, and that's the only way you think of ring, that's not helping the child develop and conceptualize all the other possibilities. You can have a ring around the collar. We used to remember that old Whisk commercial, ring around the collar. And of course, there's ring around the tub. There's a circus ring. Give me a ring on the phone. Think of all the ways you can use just the word ring. And that's the kind of beginning vocabulary we use and instruction, and then having them expand from there. And then at that point, when they're fluent, we start to teach them to, instead of learning to read, reading to learn. And it's at that point that we start introducing books that are more challenging, that have a lot of content, but we still front load it. We tell them what the book is about. We tell them as much as we can for vocabulary so that it's going to be comfortable for them to read. We want them to succeed. We want them to be comfortable. The only way we can do that is if we work as teachers very hard to make sure that that comfort level is there. Now that's called structured literacy. And when I do a structured literacy lesson, which I do every day, by the way, I make sure that I am pacing the child, that I am monitoring exactly where that child is on that reading continuum. And it makes sense, and it follows the research, because that's what the research says. The research is very clear as to how we teach our children. And as I said, this goes back to 1985, when that Health Research Extension Act started to investigate this. They started out with 10,000 children. Believe it or not, they have over 210,000 today. It's called the longitudinal study, and it's still going on, which is amazing when you think of how many students have contributed to this database. The other interesting thing is that the numbers really haven't changed. 50% of the kids, maybe 60, depending on your demographics, will learn how to read with ease. 40 to 50 will not. They will find it to be the hardest thing they do in their lives. And this is where we really have to start paying attention. Because now what we're seeing is something called balanced literacy. What on earth is balanced literacy? Well, unfortunately, balanced literacy is the whole language notion of we'll add a little bit of phonics in and everything will be okay. That's really not the case. That's not how reading instruction goes. But I'll give you some examples of balanced literacy. It's usually a top-down approach. And what I mean by that is that the teacher shows the child a book. And I brought a book with me. I have a Cinderella book. Now, there's over 360 Cinderella stories worldwide. There's the Egyptian Cinderella and the Korean Cinderella and the African Cinderella. A lot of Cinderella stories. This happens to be a very delightful one. It was written by Barbara McClintock, and a teacher who is doing that balanced literacy approach will show the children the book. We'll say a little bit about Cinderella. And in order to keep their attention and to have them understand about the idea of what the book is, the teacher, of course, has some beautiful illustrations. These illustrations are gorgeous. And Barbara McClintock, by the way, has a cat named Pip. And Pip shows up in a lot of her stories or illustrations. Well, the children are looking for Pip. They're looking for that little cat in the picture. They're not looking at the words. They're looking at the pictures. They're looking for Pip. They're listening to the teacher read the story. And the teacher does what's called modeling. So the teacher models a story. In other words, she reads it and reads it and reads it again. Well, what do we know children can do if they hear stories a lot? Yeah, they memorize. Reading is not memorization. But these poor kids come home with a book and it's beautiful and it's well illustrated and they say, I can read. And they open up the page and they look at the picture and they start to read. They're really memorized. They've memorized the whole thing once upon a time, and they just keep on going. And the parents don't know. The grandparents don't know. Nobody knows that the child has heard this so many times that it's memorized. And unfortunately, when push comes to shove and they're given literature without pictures, literature that somebody hasn't read to them many times, most of the time they're not able to read it. Now the teacher can give them artifacts and show them artifacts. For example, as we know, Cinderella has a glass slipper. Now this happens to be a ceramic slipper, and I have it instead of a glass one simply because it matches the illustration in Barbara's book. And of course, one of the other things is that gorgeous coach, Cinderella's gorgeous coach. And I have this lovely diamond, well, obviously crystal encrusted coach. And it's attractive. It's exciting. I can talk about the different places in the world that we see Cinderella and we see the different Cinderella stories, and I can have a map of the world, and I can do a whole unit and put little pins in the map for all the different Cinderella stories that I've read to the students. And we can talk about the migrations of people. It's very exciting, and it's intuitively appealing to adults. It's very appealing to adults. We love that kind of thing. But imagine a child who doesn't have the 45 sounds of the language, trying to match up the sounds that they're taught. A says ah, okay? Every time they come to a word with a in it, and then they're corrected and told, well, no, that's not right. It says something else. But they don't know what the sounds are. They've never been taught at that level. And they're trying to make some sense of it. And it's all a muddle. But because phonics has been introduced in a haphazard way in this balanced literacy program, the kids think there's something wrong with them. They think they're at fault. They think they're stupid. And that brings in a mental health issue. And that mental health issue is getting more and more pronounced because our children do not understand it's not them. It's the way they're being taught. So now you're probably saying, well, I'm a little unhappy with these teachers that they're not teaching my child the right way. And I have to tell you that teachers teach the way they're taught to teach. And if a teacher is taught to teach this balanced literacy, which is a glorified whole language program, this teacher doesn't know any better. And the teacher will keep on teaching balanced literacy, thinking that showing them the books and showing them the artifacts and showing them all of this great stuff with the maps will make all the difference in the world. Not knowing that 50% of those children are never going to get that type of approach. So what do? Well, those of us that have been in the field a long time, right here in New Hampshire, worked very hard to get a dyslexia law passed. We worked at it, and the law has been passed. But schools are sometimes reluctant to admit children are dyslexic because that means that they have to do a structured literacy program. They also have to realize that it's not just the dyslexic child that benefits from structured literacy. All children do. Even if they've learned to read well, spelling still factors in. And learning to spell with a structured literacy program will virtually guarantee that child will be a far better speller than if somebody in a schoolroom somewhere is expecting them to memorize 10 or 15 words a week, because that doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work. So structured literacy is also good for spelling. And once a child has automatized not just the reading, but the spelling portion of the language, that child then can go to the next step for written expression. Having a child just sit down and write without any of the skills is not beneficial, it's just stressful. We're trying to make the job of childhood easier. We're trying to help these children hit success every single step of the way. And in order to do that, a shift has to happen. That shift has to happen starting at the college and university level. It means that the professors are going to have to start teaching properly. They're going to have to start teaching teachers how to teach structured literacy, what the structure of the language looks like, what the structure of the reading development looks like. It doesn't seem that we're making many inroads at that level. Those of us that have been writing and researching and putting out information over these years. I think it's going to have to be something that parents are going to require, grandparents and concerned citizens. I'm not saying causing a revolution here. What I'm saying is respectfully, parents that are sitting down with teachers have to ask the right questions. Are you teaching my child to read with a structured literacy approach or a balanced literacy approach? If they're saying balanced literacy, then as parents or grandparents, you have the right to say, show me the results, show me the testing, because there's something else out there called Rti Response to Intervention. Children should be tested in the classroom probably every 6 to 8 weeks. And if the child is not being successful in this balanced literacy program, then this child needs to be switched, and switched quickly. And parents have the right to ask, are you teaching with balanced literacy or are you teaching with structured literacy? And then show me the Rti results, okay? Once that hurdle is sort of gone over, what's the next step? Well, the next step is to make sure the teachers are instructing with what's called fidelity to the program. In other words, the teachers have to do the whole program, not little bits and pieces. Little bits and pieces would be the balanced literacy, where, I can bring phonics in if they don't understand it. But let's see if they can memorize it first. Or let's see if they can guess. Look at the first letter and guess the rest of the word. That's the wrong way to do things. Believe me, that's the wrong way. What does research tell us? Research says that if you guess looking at the first letter, on the average, children make 7 incorrect guesses before they get to the right word. We don't want that kind of process because it interferes with automaticity and fluency. And I told you that's one of the steps towards reading to learn, right? And so if they don't have automaticity, if they don't have fluency, it develops another problem. So what I'm suggesting is fidelity to the program, structured literacy. paying attention to those 45 sounds, those phonemes in the language, remembering very clearly that sounds make words, and then finding out what the program is that the child, your child, is in. Finding out how well the teachers are trained in structured literacy. Find out exactly where on that continuum, that developmental reading continuum, your child is. And then asking some pretty specific questions. Who's backing this teacher up? Where's the reading specialist? Who comes in and helps this teacher? Is the reading specialist trained in structured literacy, or is this reading specialist trained in balanced literacy? What are you using for books? What are you using for interventions? If my child is not doing well in the classroom, it's called the regular classroom instruction, regular tier 1. My child should be going into tier 2, which is a small group of no more than 7 children. Who's teaching tier 2? What are their skills? And is it a balanced literacy or is it a structured literacy? And if my child is not doing well in tier 2, they need to go to tier 3, which is one-on-one instruction. And now tell me who's doing that. And is that individual trained in structured literacy, or is that individual trained in only balanced literacy? Because the law is very clear. If a child is supposed to be given a program where he or she is being taught to read, that child needs to be taught, one, with fidelity, but also that child has to have the same curriculum taught a different way, not a different curriculum taught the same way. That makes a huge difference. So the children still have to get what everybody else is getting, but they get it in a one-to-one situation instead of small group or instead of whole group. It depends upon the needs of the child. So you're not putting the child into a program you happen to have. You're putting a child into a program that he or she needs in order to learn to read, so that their first job, which is learning to read, will be successful. And once they have become successful at every step of the way, then they will become good readers. Hopefully they'll learn to love to read, but at the same time, they'll be able to pick up these beautifully illustrated books, and they will be able to engage with these books, not from memorization, but from reading the words automatically and reading the words fluently. And when that happens, they have become readers. And that's what we want for all children. As I said, we have 54 million children in school in America, and 25 million of them are not reading at grade level. And in fact, many of them are substantially below grade level. What does that say? It says we have to make some changes. We have to make these changes pretty fast. This is my message. This is my plea. We need to be all unified in this regard. We need to all be working toward the same goal, literacy for all our children. Because we know that if we start at the first grade level and keep that process going and teach them correctly, virtually all children will be able to learn to read. I can't argue with the statistics that I've seen. I hope you are with me, you join with me in this. Stay tuned for more. Thank you so much.